Great, thank you, Leslie. Hi, Patrick. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to those that are joining us for the second time, and welcome to those who have it's your first webinar with us. We thought that today we would sort of split the session into three sections. So focus a little bit on where we are now and what we have to do, what some of the scenarios are that we're possibly working with going forward. And then just thinking about the sort of objectives and choices that we've got. And I guess also from my point of view, I kind of feel like last time we focused quite a lot on the positivity that could come out of this crisis. And I think both Patrick and I feel that that's a really important angle to have on this webinar, to be thinking about at this time when the uncertainty can feel quite crushing to all of us, to be sort of thinking and noticing what are the things that we want to come out of it and how can we help our boards in that type of decision making and the way forward. Just before I ask Patrick a question, I'd just say encourage you to ask questions as we go, as things come up, and we'll do our best to pick up and answer all of those questions. I just wanted to sort of start off by just saying that I've noticed a couple of things in the last week or so particularly. And that is that we seem to have shifted as we start to think about moving out of the crisis into a place where instead of seeing the health crisis and the economic crisis as being two separate things, that we're now starting to see that those things are absolutely interlocked and woven together, and things that are not opposing forces, but are things that are highly dependent on each other. So I'd like to start by asking Patrick a few thoughts about that, if I may. How have you, with the boards that you're working with, how are they seeing those two sort of separate angles?
I think you're absolutely right. And just before that, I'd like to reinforce the point about looking for the positive and what we can benefit from this awful situation in terms of the way we work and the way we do boards. And one of the rallying cries of the UN is always that build back better, you know, when they're doing disaster recovery. And I think a number of people have picked up on that. This is not an original thought, but I think that's quite a good frame of mind to think that actually we do need to rebuild from this shock. And how can we build back better? In terms of the interwovenness and the interdependency of health, business, all sorts of things, I think there's no doubt that they're all interwoven, and there's no doubt that the consequences of taking a decision in one place affect things over here. In terms of where we are now, should we look at kind of where I think we might be now? I think we're all working on a kind of interesting cocktail of fact and interpretation and statement and all the rest of it. I think there's where we are now as a society, as a business community, a charity community, a public sector community, and what matters hugely to everyone is where they are now, because this is not a homogeneous impact on people. So I had a fascinating lunch yesterday with a group of FTSE chairs and senior independent directors from a broad range of sectors, all very differently impacted, but all had some of the same common things. And one of the things that was clear from that call was that there are fundamentally three macro economic scenarios and fundamentally three sort of scenarios that people are using to come out of the crisis as their base case, recognizing that there's not a lot of point betting on which one will be the most likely or whatever way you want to frame that, but actually taking an approach where if this happens, then we will do that. So one of the things in terms of the way that many people are approaching where we are is to take it's more or less from lockdown to lockstep. So we're saying we will take these decisions almost like a decision tree process if these things are in place. But originally, I think people had four economic scenarios. They had a V, sort of sharp shock, and then suddenly out of it, which there's some data from China suggesting that's what seems to be happening there. One of the big consumer company chairs yesterday was saying, actually, there's been a massive trend in China towards what's called revenge shopping. So beat the virus again by shopping and making yourself feel good, and sales have been roaring away in some things for that. I think as far as the UK is concerned, I think the V is highly unlikely unless there's some miraculous event around a vaccine quickly, and that is able to scale up. I think a V is kind of very optimistic. So I think we're with the others, and the others are U, L, and W. This is really not good for dyslexics. This I may have got these in the wrong order, but the U is like a bath-shaped thing where there's quite sharp fall, long period of down, and then a recovery. L is a depression, effectively. And what most people also think is worth thinking about is a W, a wiggly waggly line to where we get to, with a few false starts and a few sectoral shifts. And we're seeing that in aviation and transport. On the lockdown, I think the scenarios are slightly similar, that we suddenly be released from lockdown and everyone can get back to work. I think, again, that's proving very unlikely, despite everybody's wishes. There's a gradual release, which is clearly what our government is sort of going for. And that's tough because it doesn't deliver the clarity that people want. That's a challenge. Or there's a very extended period. I think we're into the gradual bit, now. In terms of the facts, the reporting yesterday in terms of GDP down 2% for the first quarter is not the number to look at. The number to look at is this current quarter, and the Office of Budget Reporting is saying that's likely to be down 35%. So that's a very different thing.
So just pause there, Patrick, for a moment, and just if we think about those sort of four scenarios. So there is some optimism from China that we're hearing about, and then you've talked through the U, the L, and the W, and it sort of feels a little bit like the W is kind of almost everybody's worst. Is a sort of a fear that it's going to get better and then get worse again and then get better again, and that sort of overwhelming kind of sense of uncertainty, which is difficult for people to sort of live with, but really important that we do stay in that kind of reality of the moment. So what sort of advice are you hearing from boards? What sort of advice are you giving to boards about managing that sense of living with this high degree of ambiguity?
Well, I mean, I don't believe that things will return to normal, or even that there will be a new normal, other than that the new normal might be greater volatility in all sorts of things. So if you take that definition of a new normal, perhaps just being greater volatility, and the old sayings that the only certainty is that things are uncertain, I think that's the way to think about it. So you have to plan in much greater levels of resilience, much greater levels of financial and human reserve. I think we've all been wonderfully surprised at the levels of human reserve, if I could call it that, that we've seen in organisations. I mean, we talked the last time about, this is when stars really emerge, and that's definitely been the case. But a lot of people can adapt to doing something different for a short time, but maybe less happy doing that if that's on a sustained basis. And so I think we have to be mindful of the things that are working for us to get through this sudden shock phase. And it literally has only been a couple of months. They may not work in a sustained way. And so as a board, we have to think through both of those things. And that links to the sort of people you might have on your board. You need people who can deal with a lot more uncertainty.
Yeah. So in this sort of in this kind of environment of new normal being uncertainty, high degree of ambiguity, we have to get better at dealing with that. I had one chair I was working with this week who said to me that he considers it a game of improvisation. So on a daily basis, they are thinking about the skills that you need to be really good at improvisation. So improv is all about listening to the other person, being really open and non-judgmental, and then using yes and, so collaborating. So they've sort of adopted this kind of lovely kind of actors sort of skill around how do you engage people in a way which encourages people to embrace the kind of ambiguousness of the situation and find where we can go. The other thing that I'm really fascinated about is we're seeing quite a lot as we go out into, as we unlock organisations really having to consult very hard with their employees in a way that perhaps they haven't ever really felt they've had to do before. And this seems to me a very positive and good trend, that boards and execs are learning that skill of consultation is really helping them in their decision making. And just, I'm wondering if you've observed that.
Yeah, so two things really. On the improv, I think comedians are fantastic at doing improv, and actors can be wonderfully entertaining, but that doesn't mean you want to trust your livelihood with them. And so I think there's an ability to respond and be quick on your feet and the rest of it. But I think you need to combine that with more rigorous thinking and planning as well. So there are a lot of people I know who are brilliant at winging it, but they don't necessarily make good leaders in a sustained way, and particularly in a crisis. So just a cautionary note on the improv bit, but it's true. In terms of the consultation, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, some people were doing it anyway, and I think the rise of the so-called next-gen boards, which Gucci, the FT, Interbrand, many companies have been doing lately, have been a very good way of plumbing that into the thing. Basically, yesterday on the call with FTSE chairs, a common problem was with all the board calls, board meetings, stakeholder meetings, time for the key board members is really tight. But I think everybody on the call felt, and everyone was actually doing it, was carving out some time every day to join a team meeting in a division somewhere, or a leadership group meeting, or something like that, almost every day, so that they could actually see the people for themselves, that they're okay, was one point, but also hear from them, and really find out what's happening on whatever the front lines or midlines are. So I think it's really critical that and it matters in terms of making good decisions, that you're not just making them in a vacuum on your own or with a very small group of people.
Yeah. Now, we've got a few poll questions, and I just wanted to kick off with the first one. Leslie, if you could just put up the poll about how confident is your workforce about this being the right time to return to work. Let's sort of look at the confidence levels from participants. While we're waiting for that poll answer to come through, Patrick, you talked there about board members and execs really getting into team meetings, and being present, I guess, is a really important skill at this time, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. But it's not to interfere in that. So I'm doing one very soon with one of the organisations where there's a big meeting of the younger kind of people in the organisation who are more affected by they're living in shared flats, or they've got young children. And they're sort of talking about all that together, and I'm just joining them for it's called a virtual lunch, but it's an odd concept, but that's kind of my way, and they're summarising for me the issues that they feel it would be helpful to address and so on. But I think if you're on a board, all those times you go to the places, you're meeting people, you're picking up. Your antennae are picking up stuff, and we're kind of denied that unless we proactively do something about that. I think is probably the key point.
Yeah, so that sort of sounds together. So the poll results are up, and interestingly, we're still in the zone of slightly confident, not confident at all, being the majority vote here. So a lot to deal with in terms of getting more consultation around how people will get back to work and what will help them to feel safe and well. I heard from the chairman at Sainsbury's last week that he was saying they've never spent so much time in a board talking about face masks. You know, that one topic has really absolutely captured the conversation, the decision making. And he's saying what's fascinating is all the evidence suggests that face masks are not helpful in all situations. They're very helpful if you have the disease, transmitting it to others, but not necessarily other situations. And yet they've made the decision to go with face masks because it makes people feel safer. You know, psychologically, people feel safer if they wear a mask.
I think that's one thing that you have to be conscious of as a board is how can you reduce the number of uncertainties? So you won't reduce uncertainty overall, but there are some things by taking action like that. You know, scientifically, you know, it may or may not make a big difference one way or the other. But actually, if people just feel more comfortable, then it's worth the investment.
Yeah. So there's a question here from Peter Thomas, picking up on your point, Patrick, about resilience and the human element. And he just wondered if you've got any thoughts around the battleground around culture being a key component for organisations going forward. And that taps into this conversation we're having about how do you reduce uncertainty? How do you help people to feel more confident?
So what I've done really, where I'm on the board and particularly chairs, to say at the beginning of this, how should we be working together? What really matters in terms of values? And we need to make sure everybody understands that and they work to those values, because individuals will be taking decisions, you know, on the spot on particular things within parameters, of course, but they will be taking decisions. And I think the police was an interesting example of this, where, you know, there was a general guidance and some people interpreted that in very different ways, which is very hard to manage, and very hard for the board of a police board to sort of to manage that. So I think setting the tone, being clear what is expected, you know, people's health and safety is absolutely, you know, the prime priority. You know, then you can sort of order things in other ways is really critical, I think. In terms of the resilience, I think it's really hard to have a resilient organisation without resilient people. And so I think, you know, I think we're learning a lot about how resilient people really, really are through this. And I think that will influence our recruitment decisions, all sorts of decisions as we go forward.
Yeah, so we're starting to sort of see we've kind of had a bit of a conversation here about where are we. We know that we're returning, we're trying to get the country back out to work. There's a low level of confidence about people going back to work and a desperate concern about not wanting the virus to kick off. So let's talk about those three different scenarios, Patrick. The U, the L, the W, and what organisations might do to manage through those different types of scenarios.
Yeah, so especially again, going back to the power of three, I think there are three sort of, for your individual organisation, there are three sort of things to think about in each of those things. So there's kind of a resilience set of thoughts. So how can we protect ourselves against the worst that might happen? Then there's a kind of recovery bit. How can we recover as quickly as we can from those things? And then more optimistically, you know, how can we research the organisation? Because recovery is just sort of steady, if you like. So I think in terms of making the choices, you have to really focus on the things that you can control and the variables that you have. And if you think of your really understanding the market and what the market's doing, understanding your supply chain. So at the beginning of this, the organisation I'm involved in, we looked at, we wanted to know what the financial health of every supplier, every major customer, so that we could understand the vulnerability, fragility of both of those sites. And we've, you know, many organisations have found out that very complex supply chains that are operating at pretty full capacity anyway, it's very hard if something goes wrong. And the restart will be a bit like that, because not everyone is going back to work at the same time. And the geography of all of that, there are different things happening in different parts of the world. So understanding all that so you can get ready for recovery resurgence is pretty key before you take the decisions. I think the lockstep approach, which I mentioned before, is also fundamental to the choices that you're going to make, and understanding that.
Say a bit more about what you mean by lockstep.
So it's where, instead of, I mean, classically boards had a strategy, you had a plan and you had a budget, and you kind of agreed it, and then you kind of worked to that through the year. Many organisations were departing from that anyway, and working on budgets which were what we'll call lockstep dependent. So actually, if we have a very difficult first quarter or a very good first quarter, then actually we'll invest less or more depending on that, rather than saying this is the capital investment for the year, or this is the recruitment plan for the year, or whatever strategic things you had, you might do that. Now, you might take the view at the moment, for example, if you are actually a beneficiary from the crisis because of the nature of the products that you sell or the services you deliver, and there are other bits of your value chain that you want to sort of absorb to create more value for your stakeholders, now is a great time maybe to do that. But you might only do that if you have financial reserves of this. You might only do that without borrowing anymore to do it. So the steps that need to be, the preconditions, if you like, that need to be in place before you take a decision are quite critical. And you can make this incredibly complicated, but actually it's often makes things a lot simpler.
So in a way, what you're saying is this a sort of shift, you're seeing a shift really to decision making, which is much more driven by a small set of principles that allow the board to make decisions in a much more iterative and environment context dependent way. I mean, yeah. and I can see that, and that's a useful way of feeling like you're much more in control, and also being collaborative in how you move forward.
Yeah. Yeah, and one very important aspect, if you're going to take that approach, is I think you have to make sure that all of the board and the executive and senior leadership understand the financial dynamic of the organisation. So one of the other things it's been very important to do for boards is actually to say, look, actually, the perceived wisdom and the model that we had before and the interrelationship between things has changed. So now the financial dynamic is this. So if you look at the university sector, for example, there's a terrific report from London Economics about the impact of COVID on the university system, and it's really quite interesting. If you look at the big components of the financial model for universities, they've shifted, and you have to understand that before you take these other decisions, whatever sector you're in.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a challenge in that in itself. There's a couple of questions coming in which I'm going to deal with in a minute. But there's a challenge in that in a way with a lot of businesses, particularly consumer-led businesses, where obviously human sentiment is driving a lot of businesses at the moment. Garden centres open and people are rushing to garden centres. You mentioned in China this revenge shopping. So people are behaving in ways which are possibly some predictable, some not so predictable, and that we know will change over time. So there's a kind of there's a joy in making those shorter term decisions, but also a challenge in the current unpredictability with how people are behaving, I think.
Yeah, and the models, it's interesting. I mean, most of the economists have struggled because the key variables in their models and the interrelationship between them have shifted, and so the previous economic models don't often work for the situation now. And a lot of the algorithms that people have in terms of sales forecasting and demand supply balance within the chain, if you like, to get it to the customer, they've changed too. So one of the things that's been happening is people expect things far more quickly now in terms of delivery. I've noticed that. That's quite interesting. And it's perverse, really, but they do. They want it today, not even just tomorrow. So the predictability is more difficult, which means you have to build in greater reserve, greater resilience into the system.
Yeah. So a couple of questions about how boards are working. So what are your thoughts about boards wanting to get around the table sooner rather than later, or versus carrying on with virtual meetings? Do you think that boards have been just effective running virtually? And we were mentioning yesterday when we were chatting that actually it is quite exhausting working through virtual meetings all the time. That coupled with the uncertainty and the decision making, which is tiring in its own right. So I think there's a balance in knowing yourself that virtual environment, it's harder to connect with people, it's harder to concentrate. What are your thoughts? Are you going to be encouraging boards back around the table soon, or?
Well, I mean, priority number one is, you absolutely have to have a safe environment sort of physically first. I wouldn't encourage anyone to go back before they feel or it is safe. The other thing is, I think everyone's been, delighted in a way how well they've made things working virtually, and there will be a step change in people's use of these virtual things. But just because something you managed to make work for a couple of months in a crisis worked for that doesn't mean that's best. So if you go back to thinking about build back better, I think and another 4 weeks of this, and I think people will be craving for some, proper physical interaction. And I've noticed in terms of decision making that there is a tendency with the virtual board meetings, and also because of the context, which is forcing more rapid decision making, that, are you really talking through this as thoroughly and deeply as you could? Is everybody taking part? All of that. And some people are extremely good at sharing the Zoom board, and some people less so. So I would say I'm really looking forward to getting back together physically. I think they're higher quality meetings, but you don't need to do every meeting the same way. So even before this, lots of boards were using Zoom for informational type calls or very quick decisions or things which had a shorter timeline. And I think that should continue. I don't think it's an either or situation.
No, I have a technique that I've used a bit in the last couple of weeks. We mentioned before actually that virtual meetings are in some instances helpful to introverts and helpful from a diversity. There are a couple of comments about this around virtual meetings being focused, being effective, being good for diversity and inclusion. I've found around the decision making, I've used a technique of what I call brain writing. So if we've got a really important decision to be taken, get people to just pause and write down their thoughts and then go around the room. That gives introverts a bit more time to think things through. It helps everybody to pause and reflect rather than concentrating on the timing of interruption, when you can speak, when you can't speak, and also that sort of sense of intensity that the virtual meeting creates.
Yeah, I think that's right. But again, I think it's horses for courses, and it's picking the right tool or method, if you like, for the particular decision. I think there's a good question from Hansa here about, is there not a risk that decision making loses ground with the bigger picture? Behaviours might become more erratic. I think there are a number, well, Ali's probably the expert on this, but there are a number of contributory factors to people being erratic. That balance between effectiveness and pressure, the personal stress they might be feeling, the stress of the particular decision, all of those things, and being physically tired. So I think one of the things that I know I've had to do, and if any of the CEOs around chair on the line, they'll probably remember this, is actually really make sure you're well and you're not too tired. And that's very hard when there's so much going on. And you can only do that by delegating more, by taking proper breaks, getting a proper sleep, which is difficult if you've got really, really challenging decisions to make. So it's an easy thing for a chair to say, it's a harder thing for a CEO to do. And that's why boards must support the executive in actually getting to that right point on that kind of effectiveness and pressure curve.
Yeah, it's a good point to just have another poll question, Patrick. I'm just interested in, has the relationship between the board and the executive team changed during the pandemic? So has it got closer? Has it got further apart? Is it about the same before? Leslie, would we be able to put that poll up? Because the pressures are different, and I'm definitely experiencing with the boards that I work with some of them the sense that the executives just need a bit more space, with others actually the sense that they are really enjoying that. The extra support they're getting, and it varies by sector, but it also varies by people's skill in managing in this different environment. So just let people fill that poll in and submit, and let's just see what sort of, if there is any interesting information coming out there. Just thinking a little bit about this situation where consumer behaviour is changing, our own behaviours are changing. I'm wondering how confident boards are feeling about making decisions that are much more focused on behaviour change. So if you've not got a confident workforce and you're trying to get them back to work, this is a whole new gambit around thinking about behaviour, culture, values, and how you get people to work together. Interesting, yeah. So that poll result showing that the relationship has
become a lot closer. Yeah, I've got some. Shall I deal with that first? And yeah. So because I voted that way, and that's the way I felt. And I know that it's been hard to get that balance between oversight and support. The Venn diagram I've often used around, the board and the management and what goes in the intersection. The intersection's been sort of like a bit of a concertina as we go through this. I think it's by talking about that, what is the right sort of relationship to have, that you probably get the best point for you at the moment. Some of them have needed to be a hell of a lot closer. So some of the boards that I've seen that I thought were slightly in a parallel universe, the board and the exec, they've sort of come a bit closer together. There was one person, I won't name, who said, they've had 30 board calls with the executive in the last 7 weeks, 30. Wow. And I asked the question, how much preparation do the executive have to do for each of those board calls? And do you want them spending their time doing that, or actually managing the business? And why? Is that to actually take decisions? Is it so that the non-execs feel they're well informed? What's the point? And is that all the board, and is it all the execs? So I think some people have gone way overboard. Some people have had to have a lot of those because of the very nature of their business, and that's absolutely fine. But this was a business where that didn't need to be the case, in my view. Yeah. So, but good to hear that that's been the case. Whether executives will want it to be as close forever is a different matter. So I think you need to think about that, when to adapt the beat, if you like, on that.
And we're definitely, I mean, as we, it's a little bit like climbing a mountain, isn't it? Getting to the top is one thing, but getting down is the other. And we're in that kind of getting out, but getting down phase, which is going to be just as tough, and if not tougher, probably, and will determine whether we're successful in the long term. So that sense of pause and breath and making sure people are staying well is really vital at this particular time.
Yeah, although I think, sadly, we've only got to base camp, though. Ali, I think we've got a hell of a lot further to climb yet before we can start. But yeah, that principle is absolutely spot on.
Question here from Borg around the furlough scheme. Is it it's obviously incredibly helpful right now to individuals and businesses, but do you think it might delay the recovery as well as softening the recession?
I think the reality of the furlough scheme is all that's done is bought time. So that won't change whether your fundamental business model will work or not work in a new pattern of demand once the virus is under control. So it doesn't deal with that. It just buys time to keep the option on keeping those people if you're then going to need that. And it's a relatively short time now that it will go to July. So I don't think it will delay a recession because we're already in one.
Mm.
That's the sad reality. Will it reduce the individual economic pain for individuals? For many, yes, it will. But if your job was vulnerable in the last 7 weeks, you need to have a V shape for everybody to be back to where they were, and that just seems unlikely to happen. And it's a binary issue for individuals, isn't it? If you are one of the ones who keeps your job to this, you'll be feeling, yes, that worked, it was brilliant. If you're not, you'll think, well, actually, it just helped me get by for a while, but now I still have this difficult challenge to deal with.
Yeah. I mean, and inevitably the change that they've made to the furlough scheme around flexibility is a massively welcome change, certainly from all the businesses that I've been working with. It's given them an opportunity to think in a much more creative way about how to get their workforce back to work.
I mean, one thing is that, which I have been picking up on, is a bit of divisiveness between those who are on furlough and those that have been going in. And actually, because the furlough was kind of 80% including overtime and shift allowances and the rest of it, and because those in work have not been getting the overtime, you've got situations where people who are on furlough are being paid more than the people who are going into work, and that's created some tensions in some organisations. I mean, you're always going to have anomalies in these things, and it's a hard thing to manage. I mean, one of the things I've been saying to people is, how you conduct yourselves through this it is really important as an individual. And I mean, it really matters how you behave during this. So for those, if someone is having a laugh because they're off work and, getting paid more than someone in, then, they have a duty to be kind of responsible and considerate and empathetic about that. Mm. And still take the money, but, be sympathetic.
Well, and of course it's very easy to have a focus on the short term, but the long term, we still don't know what the long term consequences are. So, maintaining that real steady sense of purpose and clear mind is really critical for executives dealing with these types of problems. There's a question here around picking up on your Build Back Better theme, Patrick, around the wider ESG topic. So how are boards picking up on purpose, starting afresh, thinking of values and ethics, and using COVID as a reset button? So I guess it's that, are we at a point where you're starting to see boards thinking of the better, the intent to come out with a different perspective, to do things differently? I know I can share from one example I had yesterday with a board. We were talking about succession planning, and they have never really had much of a conversation around ESG and the skills required to change what they're doing strategically from an ESG point of view. Of course, it's been on their agenda, but not right at the top. And I was really heartened, I guess, by that conversation, that it has become centre and front for them.
Yeah, I think this has made a lot of people think, and although this might not be a very popular thing to say, I think if you think this is bad, if we continue to ignore climate change the way effectively we still are quite a lot, this is just a gentle warm-up act for that. So if you think of some countries in the world and the impact of that will be really, really difficult. So I think it's made people think and be more conscious of things. And also, the simple fact of lockdown has been an environmental benefit, and a lot of people actually quite like clean air, as it turns out, and are coping well in other ways. I mean, there's the cycle store near me has never had it's absolutely booming. with orders for bicycles because people are just worried about going on the trains into London. But you know, the people are getting used to doing things in a different way, and some of that will stick and some of it won't.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very important point that there is encouragement, but I guess that the optic in terms of focus on operational now versus actually what are we thinking about for the long term. I'm still, I guess, in the people that I'm working with, seeing more time at the moment focused very much operationally around the here and the now, and not so much conversation about. There's a sort of optimism, a kind of healthy optimism about there might be opportunities to change things, but not necessarily any really deep discussion.
Yeah, it's very variable, isn't it? So I think if you've, if you've operated, we talked about this briefly last week, that what a lot of people did when the things first started was to have a COVID subcommittee or a COVID task force. And they found quite quickly that narrowed the decision-making group. Those that weren't involved in that directly felt a bit excluded. And they became so triage focused, it's hard to actually think about the long term. So what a number of boards have done is had two groups, mix of non-exec and exec and other people, one focused on the here and now and one focused on the future, so that each can actually give concentrated time to those two different things. And then when the board comes together, it's talking about those two things. So there's a very large NGO I'm working with at the moment, and that's exactly the approach they've taken, to have those sort of two groups. And in the future bit, they're definitely for them, because of the countries they operate in, climate change is a massive thing for them.
Yeah. Okay, so and you cautioned last week a little bit around that approach in terms of the group focusing on the longer term strategy can sometimes go off in a way which is unhelpful. So being really careful about how that happens, but a really important point to make sure the board isn't too focused operationally. Yeah.
You have to focus on the operational things because your operational models have been tipped upside down. And if you want to survive, you have to do that. And it's very hard, given the time constraints and the other things, to get that balance right. But you know, that's what we need to do. We need to try and do that.
Yeah. Shall we come back to this, sort of think a little bit about the future, the objectives and the choices that people have got to make in the future. It still feels hard to me to be thinking about the longer term, but it is so important, isn't it, in this, you know?
Yeah. I mean, this may sound geeky actually, but I was reflecting the other day about linear programming. Sounds geeky, I know, but actually linear programming is a way of solving a problem where you have multiple objectives, you have a number of constraints, and you have to iterate to get to the answer. And I think that's the situation we're in. We have multiple objectives. We have to survive. We want to create wealth. We want to create good companies doing good things. All of those. We have lots of different objectives. We have a large number of constraints, not just financial, but human and other constraints around what we do. And it's highly unlikely that any group of people sitting in a room, however frequently, will come up with the right answer for all of this when there are so many uncertainties. And I'm not sure. I mean, someone said to me, you know, oh wow, there's never been an more uncertain time, and I don't believe that. I think it's just that we're now more aware of what the uncertainties are, and so I think if you start to think about what are our real objectives from those different sort of perspectives, really understand your constraints. And that's why I think understanding the financial dynamic and the human dynamic of your organizations is so important, because you can sit in the room and say, this is what we need to do. But have you really got the people who can do that? Can you shift them from what they're going to do to that? Are they as adaptable as they need to be? Are you really going to be able to hire? So I've seen so many calls where people have said, we're going to pivot to digital. I mean, it's more like a sort of clumsy pirouette in my experience, but you know, they're going to pivot to digital and they make that assumption as if, and then it will happen. Well, it's just not going to be like that. I mean, there's a desperate shortage of digital people. You have to invest to do it. You probably have to sort of re-engineer all sorts of aspects of your supply and distribution chain. Yeah. So be terribly realistic about that. But linear programming, if anyone is interested, it's a wonderful thing, and I've actually written something about that in the board's book, and it really isn't geeky. It's really straightforward.
Yeah. So different. I mean, it is about thinking about decision making in a different way, isn't it? And as you say, sort of thinking in the round about what is certain, what isn't certain, what do we know about now that we can control the controllable things, and try not to worry. Easy said than done. Try not to worry about the things that aren't under your control, but keeping that antennae finely tuned to seeing what's going on around you.
Yeah.
I wondered if you have any advice about good sources of information and intelligence that you think boards increasingly are tapping into, perhaps in a way that they wouldn't have done before, that should be a healthy change of behaviour going forward even.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that we all need to do is actually the national statistics in terms of cases are helpful, but you need to know what it's like locally. So, for example, there was essentially the mayor of Liverpool was on the box last night, and he was saying, you know, there's no way we're opening schools because we've got it particularly hard here. So you have to be aware of that for the places that are relevant to you. In terms of buying behaviour, you know, almost like yesterday's reporting on last quarter's GDP. Well, you know, that's interesting, but that's not what matters. What matters is what's happening next and what's the latest data. So the ONS, the Office of National Statistics site, is a really good one if you're into statistics generally, but actually at the moment it's particularly useful because they've actually got a lot more. When they call it live, it's obviously not live. Live probably means a week ago, but purchasing data, sales data for different product groups, all of that. So you can start to see that. So if you're, no matter where you are in the value chain, you can start to see those things, and regionally and so on. I think the big four are doing quite a lot and putting quite a lot of information out. So I know, because it's the one I'm closest to, because I chair the EY Foundation, that EY is doing you know, a lot of stuff around that, which is interesting. And I mentioned, you know, some of this will be sector specific, but I think, you know, in the university sector, that London Economics report was really, really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, it's there is a fascinating amount of information and educational resource that's available for free at the moment, which is both lovely, and you kind of hope it might continue, but almost certainly you can see that it won't continue as a free resource going forwards. But as you say, the big four doing weekly webinars on different topics. The FT's global conference this week, free to participate in, with some fantastic speakers. Yeah, so a real sort of, I guess, a collaboration in a real broad scale, which is quite fascinating to see. You picked up a minute ago about the strategically thinking about the skills that you need to take big strategic decisions and change the way you're doing things. How much, I wonder, are people talking about that reskilling, the shift that organisations are going to need?
Yeah, a lot. I was doing a call with a search firm and some project today, and actually a lot. So, and that's not just in. I don't know if anyone's read Rebel Ideas by Matthew Syed. It's a really good book about the power of diversity. And for him, it's not about, you know, doing it because it looks right. It's actually having good diversity because you cover more of what's known as the problem space. So you've got more insight into different aspects of whatever is the challenges that you face or the decisions that you have to take. And I think there's an element of that. And that's why I think some of these next gen boards ideas are really interesting. So if everyone's going to pivot to digital, but you've got a board that's doing its best, coping to get through the crisis with digital that can just about find the mute button, you're going to find that tricky, really. So you need a different sort of input. And I think there will be more flexible models of getting input. I think boards will get, some boards are already on this and doing it really well, but I think you'll get more calibration of thoughts before you take a decision. So I think that's quite important.
Yeah, so it could be a hope, an opportunity. Leslie, we've got a question around, are your board discussing reskilling the workforce? I'm just wondering if you could put that up as our final poll question. I noticed that there was a report out from Total Jobs today which suggested that 70% of the workforce are considering a change in sector. I mean, I guess that's an inevitability, given that we're seeing some sectors really surviving and thriving in this environment, and other sectors not.
Yeah, I'd have a cautionary note about that, which is actually, if everyone rushes to the same spot, it's going to get pretty crowded, and actually you'll destroy the market for all of those players. And actually, you can only really do that if you've got the capabilities to succeed there, which you may well have. What I think is more likely is there will be more after a pause. There'll be more acquisition opportunity to buy in those skills and buy in those market positions to make that transition to that place. And at the moment, if you look at it, the strength is with the buyer on acquisitions. It's a risky time to buy because of the uncertainty. But if you've got considerable financial strength, and this is sort of an infill nature to start with, then the risk is relatively low, and that might get you in, might enable you to reshape your business in a different way.
Yeah. Results of the poll, interesting, a third, pretty much. Well, a little bit higher, reskilling, but it's not a priority right now. So sort of difference between reskilling and buying in skills. That's going to create.
It's a great question here. What comes first, reskill or research thinking? Develop to grow, or grow then develop? From Mark Smith is a brilliant question. I think it depends on your ability to do that. So if you've got the resources, then absolutely the reskilling come first, and then you'll research more quickly. But if you haven't got the money to do it, it's actually quite tricky, isn't it?
Yeah, it certainly is. So we're sort of coming towards the end of our time together. What's on your mind at the moment, Patrick, in terms of hope for the future?
I hope the vaccine is the key. On that, I think the vaccine is the key thing. I really hope, this is probably a bit personal, but I really hope all my friends get through this alive and well and not financially destitute. I think that's really matters. And I think as a society, I hope we will learn that we are interdependent. I hope we will never hear the word unskilled again. I hated it before, and I think we've all really learned that no one is unskilled. You just have to find the thing they're good at and get them to stand up and do it. So I think for me as a society, I would hope there's some good things come out of this, and I think there will. So that's my hope.
And there's a lovely comment on the chat about maybe as a society, people will be lifelong learners. And I think I would echo that comment. Because there's one thing that I've really experienced in a joyful way, not just with boards, but with the other people around me, is people's investment in time in trying to learn to do things differently over the last few weeks, and to learn new ways to think about things, new ways to be, and almost that kind of joy of learning is a really powerful thing. And I think the other thing that I'm really really felt proud of a lot of the boards that I work with in terms of their desire to really understand what their workforce feel in a much more profound way than I probably have experienced in the last few years. And I really hope that that empathy stays with us.
Yeah, that's a good final point.
Good. Well, I think that's a good time for us to finish. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. I'll just hand you back to Leslie.
Thank you very much, Patrick and Ali. That was absolutely fascinating, really great discussion. And thank you to all of you for attending and for all the interesting questions that you sent in and the comments on the chat line. I hope you really enjoyed it. We'd love to have any feedback about this webinar, or if you've got any ideas for future topics you'd like us to discuss, then just get in touch with us at info@governance.co.uk. And thank you very much, and have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.